The paper felt cold against my fingertips, even though the late afternoon sun was spilling across the porch in soft gold. I remember the way the air seemed to thicken around me, the quiet hum of cicadas fading as I tried to steady my breathing. It's strange how a single sheet of paper can split a life clean in half. If you've ever trusted someone so deeply that you never imagined they could hurt you, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Stories like this leave marks we don't see at first. I stood there, clutching that notice, feeling the world tilt under my feet as everything I'd built started slipping away. That was the moment everything began to unravel. I never imagined my life could unravel in a single afternoon, but there I stood on my own front porch in Cedar Brook, holding a notice that told me I no longer had the right to live in the home I had poured my entire adulthood into. The words felt unreal, like they belonged to someone else's nightmare. Yet there they were in my hands, spelling out the kind of betrayal I once believed my own son would never be capable of. I remember my knees weakening, not from age, but from the shock of realizing that Evan had chosen to push me out of the very place where I had raised him, loved him, and sacrificed more than he ever knew. The world around me felt muted in that moment. Even the steady hum of cars on the street seemed distant, like the world was politely turning away to let me process the blow. I kept staring at the paper, trying to make the words behave, trying to convince myself that there had to be some kind of mistake. But the ache in my chest told me otherwise. It told me this was real. It told me my own child had signed off on it. I felt disoriented, drifting between disbelief and a kind of quiet, burning grief. How do you even begin to understand something like that? How do you accept that the person you once held in your arms could stand behind something so cold as the weight of it settled in? I knew I couldn't stay in that moment forever. If I wanted to make sense of how everything fell apart, I would have to go back to the years of sacrifice that led here, and the slow, painful shift I never saw coming. When I look back, it almost feels like another lifetime. Those quiet mornings in Cedar Brook when my days moved with a gentle, predictable rhythm. I had a modest little home on Maple Ridge Lane, nothing extravagant, but it was mine. I filled it with the small comforts that made me feel grounded: my porch plants, my worn cookbooks, the quilts I stitched in the winter. Life wasn't exciting, but it was steady. And at my age, steady felt like a blessing. Everything shifted the day I learned Evan was sick. Even now, I can still feel the way my heart dropped, how the world seemed to tilt as I tried to make sense of it. I remember standing in my kitchen, hands braced on the counter, trying to breathe through the worry. He was my only child, the person I had built my entire life around. There was never a question in my mind about what I needed to do. So I sold that little house. I let go of the place I thought I would grow old in. I pulled from every bit of savings I had managed to put away. I told myself that none of it mattered as long as he got better. Moving into his spare room felt temporary at first, like I was simply stepping in to help until he could get back on his feet. I didn't mind the cramped space or the loss of privacy. I was a mother. This was what love looked like to me, showing up, no matter the cost. I trusted him completely, and I believed every reassurance he gave me, every moment he let me think my sacrifices were making a difference. I held on to that belief because it was the only thing that kept me steady. But looking back now, I can see how those choices, those acts of love I never questioned, slowly became the foundation for something I never saw coming. And that's where the distance began to grow. It didn't happen all at once. The space between us started as something small, something I told myself was just part of him finding his footing again. After everything he'd been through, I expected some exhaustion, maybe even a little moodiness. But what I didn't expect was the coldness that slowly settled into our home. The way he began moving around me instead of with me, like I was suddenly an inconvenience in a life I had rearranged everything to support. I noticed it in the little things first, how he stopped lingering in the kitchen in the mornings, how his door stayed closed more often, how his evenings stretched later and later, with people I never met and sounds I didn't quite understand drifting through the walls. When I tried to check on him, he would pull back with a kind of irritated distance that left me standing there, wondering if I had somehow become the problem. I kept telling myself he was recovering, that this was just a phase, that maybe he needed room to breathe after relying on me for so long. I leaned on every excuse love could offer because the alternative felt too painful to consider. I didn't want to believe that my presence made him uncomfortable. I didn't want to admit that the son I sacrificed everything for seemed to want less and less to do with me, but the unease kept growing, settling into my chest like a quiet warning. Every time I tried to shrug it off, it only pressed harder. Something was shifting, and I could feel it. An invisible line forming between us that I didn't know how to cross anymore. I just didn't realize how quickly that distance would turn into something far more devastating. I remember the moment it finally happened. One minute I was standing in the hallway, trying to make sense of the growing tension in the house, and the next I was outside on the driveway with a small suitcase at my feet, the door closing behind me as if I were a stranger. There was no scene, no shouting, just a cold finality that left me frozen in place. I kept waiting for something to shift, for the door to open again, for any sign that this wasn't real. But the silence that followed told me everything I didn't want to hear. I stood there for a long time, unable to move, feeling the weight of every sacrifice pressing down on me. The house I had helped keep afloat, the life I had poured myself into, the son I had given everything for, it all felt impossibly far away, even as it sat just a few steps behind me. Eventually, I picked up my suitcase and walked to my car. I didn't know where to go. My savings were nearly gone, and all I could manage was a small, worn-down motel on the edge of town. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet, and when I finally sat on the stiff mattress, the grief hit me in a slow, crushing wave. I felt emptied out, like someone had quietly taken my entire life when I wasn't looking. As I sat there in the stillness, trying to steady my breathing, I heard a sudden knock at the door, sharp, unexpected, cutting through the quiet like a warning. The knock at the door jolted me upright. It was 9:40 p.m., a time when the world outside my thin motel walls felt distant and unfriendly. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the door, my heart thudding with a fear I couldn't quite name. When I finally stood and opened it, the man on the other side didn't look threatening, just steady, calm, and carrying an expression that told me he wasn't there by accident. I could tell immediately he knew who I was, and whatever he had come to say wasn't going to be simple or gentle. When he stepped inside, the room suddenly felt even smaller. He carried a folder that looked too thin to contain anything good. As he spoke, I found myself clinging to the tone of his voice, trying to piece together the meaning behind his measured words. It took time, long, aching seconds, before the truth began to settle in. Evan hadn't been receiving treatments. He hadn't been sick in over a year. Every visit I thought he'd gone to, every bill I drained my savings to cover, every moment I spent worrying that I might lose my child, all of it had been constructed, rehearsed, and fed to me with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much I loved him. I remember staring at the folder when he placed it on the table, its documents confirming what my mind refused to accept. Forged invoices, fabricated medical notes, patterns of transfers that led straight back to Evan. It felt like the ground was sliding out from under me, like my entire body had gone numb and heavy at the same time. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't emotional distance or poor choices. This was deliberate, calculated, criminal. And as the weight of it settled in, I could feel the air in the room shift, signaling that this was only the beginning of something much darker I would soon have to face. The next morning, I felt like I was moving through water. Every step toward the investigator's office in downtown Cedar Brook felt heavier than the last, as if the truth I'd learned the night before had settled into my bones. I barely slept. My mind kept circling the same impossible thought my own son had crafted a world of lies detailed enough to fool me for months. When I walked into the office, the quiet hum of the old fluorescent lights felt almost accusatory, as if they were illuminating every blind trust I had ever given him. He ushered me to a small table already covered with folders. I remember staring at them, afraid to open even one. But eventually, I reached for the first packet, seeing the forged invoices laid out in front of me, dates I recognized, names of hospitals I thought he had gone to, treatments I had prayed would save him. Each one twisted something deeper inside me. I could trace my own desperation in every number I had transferred. Every time I told myself that money didn't matter as long as he lived. What broke me wasn't just the fraud itself. It was the precision, the planning, the way the documents had been altered months before he ever asked for help. It meant he had known all along what he intended to do. As I moved from one folder to the next, the investigator gently added context, and I could feel my grief shifting into a painful clarity. Bank transfers that didn't match his story, insurance claims filed under false pretenses, patterns that stretched farther than I wanted to imagine. A cold fear crept in as the realization took shape. I wasn't the only one he had deceived. The trail pointed outward, toward people I didn't know, lives he might have touched the same way he touched mine. And as that truth settled over me, the investigator mentioned there was someone else who had come forward, someone with her own story to tell. When the investigator told me someone else had reached out, I felt a cold flutter of dread move through me. I didn't know what to expect, but I certainly wasn't prepared for the young woman who stepped into the room a few minutes later. Emily Reyes looked like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes kept drifting downward as if she was afraid to meet mine. I could sense the guilt radiating off her before she said a single word, and something inside me softened, recognizing another person who had been caught in Evan's orbit. As she began describing her time with him, I found myself piecing together her story through her expressions, her pauses, the way she seemed to brace herself before remembering certain moments. It became clear that Evan had woven the same kind of emotional traps around her that he had around me. She spoke about behaviors that made sense only now. His secrecy, sudden changes in schedules, unexplained amounts of money that passed through his accounts, and the odd way he gravitated toward older adults he met through volunteer groups. Hearing her explain how he charmed them, how he listened closely to their vulnerabilities, I felt a chill go through me. This wasn't an isolated betrayal. This was a pattern. Emily's voice cracked when she admitted she had ignored signs that something was wrong, signs that now painted a picture far darker than either of us wanted to believe. As she shared what she'd discovered, hidden bank withdrawals, copied IDs, and odd financial movements, I realized Evan had been running this deception long before he ever pulled me into it. By the time she finished, the room felt different, heavier. I wasn't just looking at my son's choices anymore. I was staring at the edges of a network built on manipulation and exploitation, one that was about to unravel completely. I thought I had already reached the limit of what I could bear. But when the investigator laid out the next set of files, something inside me shifted. He explained that after speaking with Emily, he began cross-checking names, payments, and social connections. That was when the pattern emerged, an unmistakable thread linking Evan to a growing list of older adults from different corners of Cedar Brook. Men and women he had met through volunteer programs, senior centers, even community outreach events I once praised him for joining. One by one, their names appeared in front of me, each attached to financial transfers, strange withdrawals, and documents that looked eerily similar to the ones he used on me. As I read through the summaries, I felt a heaviness settle over my chest. Every story carried its own quiet pain. People who trusted him, people who believed he cared, people who had no reason to suspect someone so young and charismatic would target them. I found myself imagining their faces, the fear or confusion they must have felt when they realized something was wrong. It broke me in a way I didn't expect. I wasn't just grieving what he'd done to me anymore. I was grieving what he had done to them. The investigator showed me messages pulled from social accounts, subtle patterns in his interactions, even the manufactured crises he used to draw sympathy. It was all so carefully constructed, so intentional. That was the part that hurt the most. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a bad decision spiraling out of control. This was a network, a strategy, a deliberate system built on the vulnerabilities of people who should have been protected. Somewhere in the middle of those files, my sorrow began to change shape. Grief softened into resolve, and a sense of responsibility took hold. If these people had been hurt the way I had, then I needed to stand with them, even if it meant facing Evan in ways I never imagined. By the time I closed the final folder, I knew the investigation was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It was about preparing for the moment I would have to confront it, publicly, legally, and face to face. The morning of the hearing, I felt a kind of stillness inside me that didn't feel like calm. It felt more like everything in me had been scraped raw, leaving nothing but a quiet determination to carry me forward. As I dressed, my hands shook, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of what the day meant. I wasn't just walking into a courtroom. I was walking toward the version of my son I never wanted to believe existed. The courthouse in Cedar Brook had always seemed unassuming, but that day it felt enormous. The echo of my footsteps along the polished floor sounded too loud, too exposed. When I stepped into the courtroom, the air felt heavy, thick with tension and murmured conversations. I kept my eyes down at first, afraid of what I might feel when I finally looked at him. But eventually, I forced myself to raise my head. Evan sat at the defendant's table, smaller than I remembered, as if the truth had shrunk him. His shoulders were tight, his jaw set. When his eyes met mine, something flickered. Guilt, anger, fear. I couldn't tell. I only knew it wasn't the boy I raised looking back at me. As the proceedings unfolded, I felt myself drifting between grief and a strange, steady clarity. The evidence was read aloud in pieces I already knew, but hearing it spoken in that room carved the reality even deeper. When the judge finally called my name for the victim impact statement, my legs felt like they were carrying someone else forward. I spoke from a place I didn't know I had. I shared how it felt to lose my home, my savings, and the trust I built my life around. I let myself express the confusion, the heartbreak, and the painful acceptance that my own son had engineered all of it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth carried its own weight. When I finished, I looked at Evan again. His expression was strained, his eyes darting away as if the words were too much to face. And in that moment, I understood that accountability had finally reached him. The judge took a slow breath, lifted the file, and prepared to read the sentence. When the judge finally read the sentence, the room felt impossibly still. I remember hearing the words, but they moved through me like distant echoes, softened by everything my heart had carried up to that moment. I didn't feel triumph or relief. What I felt was a quiet release, as if the weight pressing on my chest for so long had finally loosened. I walked out of the courthouse knowing nothing would ever return to what it once was. Yet somehow, I also knew I could begin again. The days that followed were slow and strangely gentle. I let myself breathe in ways I hadn't allowed for months. I stayed in a small rental on the edge of Cedar Brook, a place with creaking floors and sunlight that reached me every morning whether I wanted it or not. Those mornings became the beginning of my healing. I learned to make coffee without rushing. I took walks just to hear my feet on the pavement. I tried to sit with the silence instead of fighting it. As the weeks passed, I found myself reaching out to others who had been hurt by Evan. Some shared their stories with trembling voices, others with long, exhausted sighs. Listening to them softened something inside me. We weren't bound by shame anymore. We were connected by survival, by the choice to keep moving, even when the ground had shifted under us. I started volunteering at a local senior center, offering simple support, rides to appointments, help with paperwork, even just company. Every time I helped someone, I felt another piece of my identity return, not as the mother who had lost everything, but as a woman rebuilding her life with intention and care. I don't pretend the pain is gone. It settles beside me in quiet moments, reminding me of what was taken. But now, it also reminds me of what I reclaimed: my voice, my clarity, my future. If you've lived through something that broke your world open, I hope you'll share a piece of your story too. Sometimes healing begins when we speak the truth out loud. There's a quiet kind of peace that comes at the end of a long road, and I feel it now in a way I never thought I would. My life didn't return to what it was, but it found a new shape, one built on honesty, resilience, and a deeper understanding of what it means to heal. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's that even in the darkest moments, we can still choose to move forward with grace. Thank you for staying with me, for listening, and for letting my story sit with you for a little while. It means more than I can say. I wonder, have you ever had to rebuild yourself after a deep betrayal? I'd truly like to hear your experience. If this story spoke to you, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe for more heartfelt stories.